right. Well, happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to another future focused weekly update where we are keeping you ahead of the curve at the intersection of business, technology, and the human experience. I've got 5 updates again. I joked about it in my comments last week that, every week I go, well, maybe this week I'll be quiet and I won't have that much to talk about. But that, as it stands today, that is not the case. So anyway, one quick request, as I made last time, if you find these helpful or if you enjoy it, first of all, please share along things that you're curious or you'd like my input on. I always enjoy engaging with folks. I've got a couple of those this week. Also, if you find these helpful and you have not, it always helps me and helps others to find this stuff if you would toss a review or a rating on whatever platform you consume this from, just to help to get the message out. All right, so it is March 8th. The 5 things I've got. The first one is a little bit on a lighter note, but it, I think still kind of brings some of the bigger questions in. If you didn't see it over the last week, there was this viral image that was floating around on Twitter of just a throwback to the 80s of a dude smoking cigarettes in McDonald's, and it went all over the place. And then it turns out this whole thing was a deepfake. It was a fake image. It was completely AI generated, and it caused quite a stir with things. Now, my point in talking about this isn't so much to draw a ton of attention to the item itself, so much as some of the bigger discussions that went on with it. Now, looking at the picture, if you just quickly glanced at it, I can see where you would think it was real. But if you actually take a little bit of time to look at it, you would start to go, something doesn't quite look right with it. There's, he doesn't really have wrists. When the way his hands he's holding something is a little strange. So even some of these patterns that we start to pick up with how AI does things differently than anybody really does in real life are there. So if we look closely at it, you would start to see this. But with some of the discussion that it's really circulated, and I think this is an important discussion to have, is how often do we not take the time to look at things? And while this may be innocent, you start to go, well, what if somebody had done this with something that was less innocent and a less comical, dude with no oh yeah, that was the other part. Just I'm reflecting on this. I actually have the image up here to remind me of it. It's hilarious because he's got shirt sleeves. I actually go look this thing up and you'll probably get a kick out of it just in general. Look, it's like one of those, I think back to I can't remember what the book was, like the Scholastic book where there's like a picture, like find what's wrong with this picture. And I'm actually curious how many things you can find. But the one that made me just laugh when I looked at it, that I immediately went, this is totally AI, is he's got a white t-shirt on, at least at first glance. So you look at the sleeves and you're like, oh, he's wearing a white t-shirt. But then you look and you're like, but he's showing chest hair. So how is this dude? He's magically wearing sleeves that come up over his shoulder, yet nothing in the middle. And so again, there are these indicators of that, but it actually takes some time. And I think you'll see if you look at this picture, once you know it's AI, you start to see it. You're like, why does the guy behind him look like an alien? Like, why are his hands like that? Why is the Coca-Cola logo so weird? You start to see it. Why is his hamburger cut in half? There's all these things. But if you were just to glance at it, you would go, aha, funny picture of a mullet in the 80s. And I think this goes back to the bigger point that is going to be so important. I've talked a lot about the fact that I see us moving into the age of distrust potentially, but also what it means for how we change our pattern of behavior. And I look at the current patterns of behavior we often see, which is we see or hear something and we immediately react to it as though it's 100% true. And we just go before actually taking the time to go, hang on a second. Let me take a deep breath. Let me calm my amygdala reaction and actually go, hold on here. Like, what's really going on? And is this true? Is this accurate? And so while a 1980s deepfake of a dude smoking a cigarette in McDonald's may be harmless, it does drive the deeper question of, yeah, but when is it not harmless? And maybe how could even this innocent image be used in a way, and why it's so important that as we move into an age where we can literally manufacture reality with technology, we need to be so much slower to react, more discerning in the way we approach things. And so while this light video, and again, or this light trend, which again made me chuckle. I chuckle every time I look at the picture because it just more things jump out at me. It's like you finally found the 18th thing in the what's wrong with this picture. There is a serious underlying tone to this of, hey, this is just a prime example of why we need to be so much more careful as we move into 2024 and beyond to avoid. I just think of you follow this thread too far and you can start to go down a path very quickly. So that's just, again, a call out to people who listen and watch this, just to be so careful when you read, because again, any content, you read it, it might be completely manufactured. You see it, it might be completely manufactured. You even watch a video, it might be completely manufactured. And so we just need to be careful and discerning, because the technology is not going away. It's an inevitability, but how we respond and the behaviors we need to change to live in a world that's like that are critical. So I will end with that. But again, I know the tech companies are doing some things to try and crack down on this. Google recently announced they're going to be trying to implement some additional technology to cut fully artificial content out of its search results, things like that. So I think we're going to see some efforts happen on a larger scale, but I think more importantly, we just need to, on a personal level, say, hey, what am I going to do to not get sucked into this? So I'm going to need to flip away from this in my notes. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep chuckling as I look at it. All right, let's shift gears over to fairly big announcement, I think, in the generative AI space. If you've not been following Anthropic, they're another generative AI platform, similar, competing with OpenAI, competing with Google and their Gemini product. Big announcement this week as Cloud 3 was released, which is their latest version of this. And Amazon, AWS specifically, has made the statement that they're going with Cloud. They're going with Anthropic's generative AI thing. Now, if you are not familiar with it, it's definitely something worth checking out if you use generative AI, which you probably do. And maybe you're looking at like, hey, which tool should I use? It's a pretty powerful thing. There's 3 different modes to it. There's Haiku, Sonnet, and Opus, similar to OpenAI. I've toyed around with it. It has a pro plan where you're using Opus, and the free plan, you're using Sonnet. So there's a lot of just general use if you want to experiment with this. It does have limitations, though. Unlike, it doesn't have an image generation on it. But what's interesting about this new one is Opus, their highest tier of this, is just crushing OpenAI and Gemini in benchmarks around some of the key data, like graduate level reasoning, problem solving, math, coding skills are just really high. I'm taking a look at kind of some of the charts here, the way it does Q&A and things like that. So you're going to see it's different flavors of this. It is more expensive. So if you're asking the question, well, do I use OpenAI? Do I use Gemini? Do I use Anthropic's? You're gonna have to kind of evaluate what is your use case. What's interesting though about this, because I was talking to somebody about this week, and they just went, I'm just a little bit fatigued in trying to navigate all these different Gen AI platforms and all these different ones out there and what to use. And honestly, to me, it brings back a lot of memories of the early days, and even honestly, the current days of PCs, where you had the Intel AMD debate, and every new processor chip that came out, there was this big debate. Or with graphics cards, it was, are you this or that? And are you an AMD person? Are you a Nvidia graphic card user? And, they're always running these high-end benchmarks. And I will tell you, it can be extremely overwhelming. And I get that. So if you're not someone who's highly technical or really just geeking out on this, should everyone just be thinking, oh my gosh, I just need to, learn this brand new generative AI? It honestly, I've used it fairly extensively. It works just like any other Gen AI platform. So to the average user, if you're watching this or listening to this and you're thinking, oh gosh, do I need to pick up a new tool or pick up a new I'm just exhausted. I honestly, even looking at the benchmarks in this, unless you're doing really, really, really complex stuff or doing some pretty heavy enterprise stuff with generative AI, it's not necessarily, I think, should be something that you need to really get spun up about. Now, my personal experience with it is I actually really like the more human feeling you get from interacting with Anthropic's generative AI platform. So if you do work with generative AI platforms and you feel like maybe it's not quite getting you what you want, or you feel like it's very robotic in its responses and you want something with a more of a human touch, it may be something that's worth checking out and worth kicking the tires on. But again, if you're doing anything with image generation, or if you're trying to do some other functionality, you may go, well, it doesn't do that. So now do I need a subscription to this and ChatGPT? Honestly, for the average user, I would say it's probably not worth it. But it is going to be interesting to see where these things shake out, because similar to you had the BlackBerry, and then Apple came out, and then you had Android, and then the Windows Phone, and you had all these different competing platforms. It is going to be interesting to see which ones stand the test of time. I mean, I definitely don't think Google's going anywhere. OpenAI is not going anywhere. I think Amazon AWS going on to Anthropic, and the fact they're ahead of the mark in all their benchmarks definitely puts it on the grid. And they've been on the grid for a while, so it's not like it came out of left field, but its latest release is crushing it. But I think we're going to see the same thing. OpenAI is going to come out with another thing, and they're going to, boom, their benchmark numbers are going to be up. And then Gemini is going to push it, and then their benchmark's going to be up. So I think this is just that natural competitive cycle that we're going to see, that again, you're going to have to figure out what is your use case, and then how do you do that. So what I think this gets at, though, is similar to the previous one. Instead of getting so wrapped up in the hype cycle of, well, and not be asking the question, well, which Gen AI platform should I be using? Instead of doing that, it's worth slowing down, taking the time to evaluate, well, what am I really using this tool for? Because if I'm using it for, let's say, coding, all right, then Anthropic's 85%, rating on their coding skills is significantly different than GPT-4's, 67. But again, are you going to notice it? I don't know. And I'd actually be curious from folks who are listening to this or watching this, reach out to me. I'm curious what your take is on it. I've actually used Gemini Ultra, Gemini Pro, GPT-4, GPT-4 Turbo, Cloud 3, Opus Sonnet, and Haiku. I mean, again, I personally, in my experience, do not see just this mind-breaking difference between them. The one big one for me, though, is I did really feel like Anthropic, it did feel like you were interacting more with a human, and just the way it uses language, the way it interacts with you, things like that. So, but again, curious what others think and feel on this one. All right, next up, if you have not seen this, this came out of Princeton this week. So there, and this is a throwback to the Spice Girls, the two become one. You've heard me talk about the fact that power consumption, and where is all the energy going to come from to power these more advanced, these higher powered AI platforms, and just the massive load that goes into this. Because even going back to these now AI video production capabilities that are coming into this requires massive amounts of power for these things to do this, to power these chipsets and all this other stuff. And interestingly, Princeton came out, and their Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory, the PPPL, came out and said they've had some pretty monumental success in training AI to help solve the fusion crisis. It's not a crisis, but solve the fusion problem. How do we actually get clean energy? So if you're wondering, like, what was the Spice Girls reference? Well, fusion is the smashing together of atoms to generate ridiculous amounts of clean power, which is, again, a massive innovation in the energy space if we can crack this thing. And what they did is they're actually specifically training it to prevent, I'll get a little technical here, but I'm even not a physicist or a fusion power engineer, so don't ask me a bunch of follow-up questions. But essentially what they're training it on is to prevent tearing mode instabilities. Now that may be way over your head, but one of the things, I've watched a lot of videos on how fusion works, And it's pretty amazing. If you have not watched a video of a fusion generator or a fusion accelerator, it's pretty interesting the way they smash these things together and it creates plasma. But one of the problems with this is as it creates this plasma, they're using superpowered magnets to do this thing, and it can go out of control. It's very unstable when it's doing this, hence the tearing mode instabilities, where this magnetic field just starts to go out of control with the plasma. There's breaks in the magnetic field that it loses control. It loses. Again, I'm not a physicist in this one, so don't ask me all of the details on this. But I get it because I've actually seen these generators go and you see it break and you go, okay, I can see where that's a major problem as we think about fusion power, because you're dealing with massive amounts of energy, massive amounts of heat, and you don't necessarily want this thing going wrong. And for it to be sustainable, you need to get rid of some of these things. And humans have kind of hit their cap. Well, what they've done is they've trained, and this goes back to a lot of the things, if you follow me, where I've talked about how this broad general generative AI and smart AI, we're going to start seeing it get much more specialized. And this is where we're starting. A perfect example of this at Princeton, they have taken all the data from all these fusion reactions, which again gets to some of what we're going to see over the coming years. You need lots of data to train AI. So you need to have lots of fusion reactions to have enough data to train AI on, hey, here's a problem we're consistently running into. How do we fix this? And Princeton has this week announced they've made some significant advancements in training AI to help them solve this problem. So I said at the beginning of this year, might we see sustainable fusion power in 2024? As far as I'm concerned, following this, it's still a bit of a long shot. I don't think you're going to, have a fusion generator in your backyard. Well, no, I know you're not going to have a fusion generator in your backyard this year, but this is a huge step in fusion power and clean energy, which is really exciting if you're following this, not only because of our demand for energy and our growing demand for energy, but how inefficient and messy energy is. And it's just kind of mucking up the planet. And even our clean energy that you see where you go, oh, well, what about solar? What about wind? What about water? There are trade-offs with this stuff where you go, yeah, and you got to put these giant wind turbines up on a hill, and you got to build these massive solar panels and stick them all over the place. You got to build big dams to block up the water and spin these turbines. I mean, there's a lot of things in fusion. I won't say it's perfect, but it definitely eliminates a lot of these things. So I will be continuing to follow what's going on at the fusion zone. But again, exciting announcement. If you didn't see it, it'll be interesting to follow where we go with this through the rest of 2024. All right. Next up, a question came in and it was interesting. It was in response to a couple of weeks ago. I had talked about how there was this big announcement, all these education, higher ed schools, universities are jumping on the AI degree program bandwagon where, hey, now you can go get a thing. And I just said, hang on, before everybody goes out, and I'm just kind of reiterating, you can go watch the video if you want to, but before everybody runs out and gets a degree in AI, I don't have a bachelor's degree in electricity and a master's in the internet. So it might not be the wisest decision to run out and get a master's or bachelor's in artificial intelligence. But what that led to was somebody reached out and said, what about ethics and philosophy? Might we see something more in the space of that in the workforce where companies have an ethicist at the C-suite or at a senior level helping drive some of the ethics? And actually, what's interesting about this is I have seen that already in companies that I talk to where they're either vetting this in their HR departments of, hey, is this a role that we need in the organization? Someone who's really streamlining and steamrolling ethics as we think about AI. Might that also then translate to degree programs in those spaces, things like that? I mean, I think we already probably have that covered in a lot of, there might be specializations because you can go get a degree in philosophy or ethics now. Might there be more of a specialization in technology? But I think as we translate it into the job market, I do think we're going to see a rise in this. My thoughts on it, though, are I don't know that that's the right solution to the problem. Might it be helpful? Yes. But I think about other things like just because you have a chief diversity officer or a chief compliance officer does not mean that you run an ethical, a compliance driven company or that you have diversity mapped. And in some ways, I actually, with this one, like many other ones, I actually think you run a risk if you have a C suite ethics officer. What you can inadvertently do is create a culture where people go, yeah, that's their responsibility. I'm going to wait for them to make the call on this instead of everyone seeing this as you are individually responsible, and we all need to be individually responsible and accountable for ethics in the decisions we make around technology and the decisions we make in a lot of things. What I am actually hoping this move towards a greater focus on ethics and the implications of that, what I'm hoping it actually does is it actually drives the conversation that, hey, how do we build this into the role and responsibility and the accountabilities of every employee? And how do we make that more embedded into the fabric of our organizational culture rather than, I think sometimes I've seen over the years when companies create a role, it actually results in people taking less responsibility and accountability for their actions because they literally see it as, that's their job now. I don't necessarily need to go there. But does that mean that we're not going to go down that path? I already know we are. I've already seen and talked to organizations that are starting to investigate or even actually open roles in this space. That said, I think to anybody watching and listening to this goes back to similar to the first point I made. This is an area that I think everyone is going to need to lean into and say, hey, what am I doing to establish guidelines around the ethics and morals of the decisions we make, not only around technology, but what it means for the people around us, the implications on, if you watched my live stream this week, I talked a lot about, the whole topic was about sustainability and how do we think, and not sustainability just in how do we go green, but how do we make decisions and choices by thinking through the longer term implications that often we're so in a hurry to do something, we don't think of what's around the corner. And I think the ethicist component is very similar, where it's like, well, I think we, especially as learning leaders, need to think about how do we actually build the muscle of ethics and philosophy in all of our employees? And how do we, as higher education professionals or K-12 educators, how do we do that? How do we as parents start to instill a greater value of that in people instead of seeing it as something you subjugate or delegate off to someone else to think of? But might there be roles in the corporate sphere where this becomes a bigger thing? I absolutely know that it will. So hang on one second here. All right. Anyway, so that's my response to that. I think we are absolutely going to see a rise in that potentially. I actually think it's not going to be enough, and I actually think it may cause unintended consequences. So if you are a leader, senior leader listening to this, considering this, going, hey, do we need to have a chief ethics officer? Maybe it might be helpful, but I would think it through and think through, does it fit into your existing ecosystem? But then also, how do you actually build that into the ethos and fabric of your organization? All right. Last but not least, this one, I immediately, when this headline was brought to my attention, somebody sent it over to me and said, did you see this? The University of Arkansas came out with this, I don't know if you call it a study or whatever, but they did a thing where they said, hey, look at this. AI beat humans in this creative test. They did this big test. They pitted generative AI against, I think it was 151 students or something like that, graduate students. I can't remember the specifics of it, but it was at the University of Arkansas. And please, no jokes about Arkansas if you listen to this. I mean, again, but But what it was they pitted AI against machines. And what do you know? The machines won. And the second the person sent me this headline and the thing they had sent was, does this change your perspective, or what do you think about this? Do we need to be more concerned about AI taking on more of humans' responsibilities? And the second I saw the headline, I thought, this is a clickbaity headline. I guarantee underneath the surface of this, when you really break it down, you're going to go, yeah, of course AI beat it based on the test. It was a rigged game. Or I think it speaks to how much we need to change the way we define what good looks like for human performance. So sure enough, I go read more about this. I start researching what it is that they actually did. And it was a standardized creative potential test. So it was the standardized test around creative potential. And it is extremely more misleading because as you start digging into it, you start to see that they asked students or whoever was involved in this test to come up with creative ideas around specific things. Come up with as many creative ideas as you can with this. And then they asked generative AI to do the same thing. And wouldn't you know it, generative AI kicked the humans' butts. It came up with way more ideas. So there you go. Ta-da, AI beats humans. And I just went, no, it doesn't. And what's funny is some of the articles actually even acknowledge, you could hear all the backpedaling even in the article where they're like, AI beats human. Well, but this and that and this and that. And so I immediately looked at this and went, okay, so you asked generative AI to come up with generative AI, which is trained on and has access to all of the internet and can move at speeds exponentially faster than human beings. And you went, come up with as many possible ideas as humanly possible. Of course, generative AI is going to win, because here was another interesting thing. I even looked into it and it was like, did you even grade how good the creative ideas were? And of course, well, no, there was no assessment on were these ideas even good. I mean, if you just literally said, think up, they can be the dumbest ideas ever, people would come up with more ideas than they would if you gave them criteria. So this wasn't even graded on were the ideas good, were they quality ideas. It was just a volume game of that. So one, that did not surprise me one bit that generative AI kicked humans' butts. But I look at that and go, okay, to me, that still very much speaks to how humans and AI can work together, because it speaks to a human's natural limitation. One, we don't have access to all the information. So are we going to be more limited in the volume of ideas that we can come up with? Of course we are. Do our own personal biases and insecurities limit? I mean, I have a feeling that people who are involved in this study may have even had more ideas than they shared. But again, because of their own personal biases, their own just inability to just like a sociopath, just spew things out, kind of going, well, I don't know, here you go. Of course. But to me, that's where humans and machines can work together, because again, if you need that divergent thinking of come up with as much as possible, what better tool to use AI for that then you use humans in partnership with AI to go, all right, but let's refine these. How do we actually rate and rank these? What ones are actually good ideas and what ones are actually really stupid ideas that, yeah, they may be creative and you might have a million of them, but they're idiotic and you would never do anything with it. And so to me, I look at that and go, yeah, there's absolutely a world where AI and humans work together, even in this idea of coming up with creative ideas. The other thing that, and I know I'm a little amped up about it, but this is where these headlines sometimes fire me up, because I'm just like, this isn't helpful to people when you put out a supposedly academic paper, academic study from a university saying machines are beating people. And you're like, it's not even anyway. But the other thing with this was, so not only was it grading it on, not looking at this, but now I completely lost my train of thought because I am so frustrated about these kinds of things. But again, I think my biggest point, I'm sure I'll remember it. I think my biggest point with this is, don't read these headlines and think, oh my goodness, this is the end for humanity. The machines have beat us in everything. What is even the point of it? Oh, that's what it was. What is even the point of this? Little bottom subtext in this article was, by the way, the AI requires prompting for all of this stuff. So even the ideas that it came up with, it required a human to prompt it with a creative prompt to get it to do this thing. So and I know I'm going to get the folks that are like, well, once we get to the point of AGI, it can just know what it needs and all this other stuff. But I've seen this. AI is not good with just by itself coming up with anything. And so again, don't read these headlines and panic and freak out and think, oh my goodness, AI has just completely annihilated us in everything. And oh, now it's taken creativity. What's left for us? It is not what you see on the surface. And in every situation I've seen where AI is fantastic, and I can understand where people may see it as a threat, in all of those situations, I always see a way where it's better with people involved. And there's always some role that humans play, albeit that role is changing. So I'm going to close with that to hopefully leave you encouraged with the fact that despite a headline that may have you panicked, there's no reason to be. However, at the same point, it does speak to the fact that, you know what, we are going to need to adapt, and we are going to need to change, and we are going to need to figure out how we all work together in this space. So those are the big 5 for me this week. Thanks again for listening. Hopefully you find this helpful in making sense of this crazy space and navigating everything. And I will continue to do that. So please send things along. It gives me some fun food for thought during the week to reflect on and think about. And I will be back with this next week. We will see you on the other side.